You reacted before it happened, not after, not during. Before, somewhere in your chest, your skin, your heartbeat, your body answered a question you had not yet been asked, and it did this in a laboratory, under controlled conditions, wired to sensors, while scientists recorded every fraction of a second. This is not a metaphor. It is a finding, measured and repeated and published, and it says that your body begins responding to an emotional event roughly 2 to 3 seconds before that event occurs, before the image appears on the screen, before the dice land, before there is anything, by every rule you were taught, to respond to. The real science here does not tell you that you can see the future. It tells you something far more disturbing, that some part of you seems to feel it, quietly, in the skin and the heart, below the level of thought, and that when researchers went looking for this effect with instruments instead of anecdotes, the instruments kept finding it. And after decades of experiments, after meta-analyses combining thousands of trials, after the calculated odds against chance climbed into the billions, no one can explain why it is true. That is the mystery this whole journey is about. You have felt it yourself, the phone that rings just as you think of the person, the feeling in your chest before the news came that something was wrong, the moment your grandmother stopped in the doorway and said she knew, she just knew, and could not say how. We have 100 small names for it. A hunch, a gut feeling. Something told me, and we have all been taught to file those moments under coincidence and move on. Tonight, we are not going to move on. Tonight we are going to stay with that feeling and follow it into the laboratory and watch what happens when serious instruments are pointed at the oldest intuition in the world. There is an old kind of knowing that lives in the body, and you have seen it even if you have never named it. The grandmother who feels the storm in her knees while the sky is still blue. The farmer who looks at a bright horizon and starts moving the animals in, because something in the air has already turned, something beneath weather reports and barometers, and by evening the rain proves him right. The sky has not changed yet, the body has. All through this journey, keep that image beside you, the storm you feel before the sky changes. Because what the laboratories claim to have measured is exactly that shape, moved from the weather into time itself. A pressure arriving ahead of its cause, a change in the body while the horizon of the future is still, to every eye and every instrument, perfectly clear. And when the researchers speak of skin conductance, do not let the phrase glaze past you. It is nothing exotic. It is the faint sweat of your palms, the same dampness you feel before a difficult phone call, the body's oldest tell, the reason a nervous hand feels cold and wet. That is all the sensor reads, the palm, preparing. The entire mystery of this video fits inside one homely sentence. In the laboratory, palms began to sweat for a picture that did not yet exist. Here is what is coming, so you can hold me to it. First, you will see the experiments themselves, with names, institutions, years and numbers, the skin that conducts electricity differently seconds before a disturbing image appears, the heart that changes rhythm before the card is drawn, the pupil that begins to widen before there is anything to widen for. Second, you will see why physics itself, the hardest and coldest of the sciences, has quietly lost its certainty that time only flows one way, and why some of the strangest experiments ever performed suggest the future may not be as sealed off from you as it feels. And third, you will see what the oldest traditions of the human race were pointing at when they spoke of the inner voice, the knowing heart, the feeling that arrives before the reason, and why their descriptions, written thousands of years before the first sensor, match the shape of the laboratory data with an accuracy that should not be possible. 3 promises, and one more, because this channel does not sell certainty. Near the end, I will give you the strongest objections to everything you are about to hear, at full strength, without flinching. What survives those objections is yours to keep. One thing before we begin about what this is not. This is not a video about psychics, or prophecy, or manifesting, or any of the merchandise that gets sold under the word intuition. No one here will teach you to see tomorrow's lottery numbers, and anyone who offers to is selling something. What the laboratories found is small, subtle, unconscious, and useless for fortune-telling, a lean of a few seconds in the body's deep systems, invisible to the person it happens in. That is precisely why it matters. Grand claims are easy to dismiss. A tiny, stubborn, replicated lean in the physiology of ordinary people, pointed a few seconds up the timeline, is not easy to dismiss. And the people who tried have spent 3 decades failing quietly. Small and impossible outweighs large and vague every time. Keep your skepticism. It will be honored here. Bring your own memories. They will be explained, not flattered. And keep one hand on the oldest railing there is, the one your own language gave you before any of this began. Something told me, but before any of that, let us do something most videos on this subject will never do. Let us make the skeptic's case, properly, at full volume, because it is a good case, and you deserve to hear it. Here it is. You think of a friend, and the phone rings, and it is them, and you feel a chill and tell the story for years. But how many times have you thought of that same friend, and the phone stayed silent? Hundreds, thousands. You did not count those times, because there was nothing to count. They left no mark. The mind keeps the hits and throws away the misses. This is confirmation bias, and it is not a small effect. It is one of the most powerful distortions in all of human cognition, strong enough to build entire belief systems out of nothing but noise. Every premonition story you have ever heard, including your own, could in principle be explained by it. A person who has 10,000 passing feelings a year needs only a handful of them to collide with events by pure chance, and chance will happily supply that handful, and memory will frame them in gold and hang them on the wall. That is the case against. It is airtight against stories. It is airtight against anecdotes. And that is exactly why nothing in this video will rest on a story, because there is one place confirmation bias cannot follow you. A laboratory that records every trial, the hits and the misses alike, where nothing is forgotten and nothing is framed, where the data keeps everything. And it is in that place, with the bias stripped away, that something refused to disappear. Understand what the laboratory design actually does to the skeptic's argument, because this is the hinge of everything. Confirmation bias lives on forgetting. It needs the misses to vanish, so the hits can shine. The laboratory forgets nothing. Every trial is recorded, the thousands of calm gaps along with the charged ones, and the analysis averages all of them, so a handful of lucky coincidences would drown in the sea of nothing. Confirmation bias also lives on vagueness, on feelings loose enough to fit any outcome after the fact. The laboratory permits no vagueness. The measurement is a number, the timing is a timestamp, the prediction is registered before the outcome exists. And the deepest protection of all is the randomness itself. In these experiments, the future is not merely unknown, the way tomorrow's weather is unknown. It is undetermined, generated at the final moment by a process designed to be unpredictable even in principle. There is no pattern to learn, no subtle cue to read, no clever unconscious inference that could do the work, because there is nothing yet to infer from. Strip away every path by which ordinary knowing could sneak in, and whatever remains, if anything remains, is the anomaly in its pure form. That was the bet these researchers made. Close every door, and the effect will die, and we will all go home. They closed every door. It did not die. The year is 1997. A researcher named Dean Radin, working at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, sets up an experiment of almost insulting simplicity. A volunteer sits in front of a blank computer screen. Electrodes on the fingers measure the electrical conductance of the skin, the same signal a lie detector reads, a direct window into the body's arousal, into the ancient alarm system that stirs when something matters. The volunteer clicks a button. The screen stays blank for 5 seconds. Then the computer, using a random process, selects a photograph and displays it. Most of the photographs are calm, a landscape, a cup, a chair. Some are not: violence, eroticism, horror, the kind of image that makes the body flinch. The image stays for 3 seconds. The screen goes blank. The volunteer breathes, resets, clicks again. Trial after trial after trial, everything is automated. No human being knows which image is coming, because the computer has not chosen it yet. The choice happens at the last possible moment, and the question Radin is asking is not whether the body reacts to the disturbing images. Of course it does. That is a century of textbook physiology. The question is when. Picture yourself in that chair, because you would have made a fine volunteer. Everyone would. The room is quiet. The electrodes rest on your fingers like 2 cool coins. The screen is a soft grey nothing. You click, and now you are in the gap, the 5 seconds of blank, and you know, because they told you, that what comes next might be a meadow, or might be a car crash, and there is no way to know which, because the universe itself has not decided yet. The computer will flip its electronic coin at the last instant. Nothing in the room knows the future. Not the experimenter, sitting outside. Not the machine, which has not yet chosen. Not you, especially not you. And yet, on the recording, in trial after trial, something in you is already leaning. The trace of your skin, flat and calm before the meadows, begins its slow climb before the car crashes, seconds before, while the screen is still grey, while the coin is still spinning, while the future is still, by every law you were taught in school, perfectly blank. You would feel nothing, by the way. That is one of the strangest parts. The volunteers reported no premonitions, no flashes, no dread. Consciously, the gap felt like a gap. The knowing, if that is what it is, never reached the surface. It lived in the sweat glands and the heartbeat. In the oldest layers of the body, speaking a language the conscious mind does not hear, which means the discovery is not that you can predict the future. You cannot, ask the volunteers. The discovery is that something in you appears to respond to it anyway, whether or not you are ever told. And be precise about the timing, because the timing is the scandal. The early response did not begin a fraction of a second before the image, in some blur where sloppy clocks might explain it. Not half a second before, not at the moment of selection. Seconds before, 2 to 3 of them, a span you can count on your fingers, while the random process that would choose the image had not yet run. In the physiology of the volunteers, the future was casting a shadow backward, across an interval you could measure with a kitchen timer. Nothing in accepted science permits that sentence. Signals travel forward. Effects follow causes. The past pushes. The future does not pull. These are not details of physics. They are the floorboards. The assumptions so deep that every experiment ever performed stands on top of them. Which is why the correct first response to the presentiment data is not excitement. It is suspicion, deep and stubborn suspicion, the kind the researchers themselves applied for years, checking the random generators, checking the sensors, checking the statistics, hunting the mundane leak that would let everyone relax. Keep that suspicion lit as we go. You will need it, and near the end of this journey I will hand it the microphone entirely. But hold, alongside it, the plain shape of what the instruments recorded. The body leaned toward the storm. The sky had not changed. The body should react after the image appears. Signal travels from screen to eye to brain to sweat glands. The whole chain takes a moment, and then the skin conductance rises. For the calm pictures, a small rise. For the disturbing pictures, a large one. That is the expected shape, and that is what Radin found after the images appeared. But the recording did not begin at the image. It began before the click, and what it captured in the seconds before the image appeared is the reason we are here tonight. In the 2 to 3 seconds before a disturbing image was displayed, before the computer had even finished selecting it, the volunteer's skin conductance was already rising. Not after the horror, not during the horror, before it. And here is the detail that ends every easy explanation. Before the calm images, the early rise was absent, or far smaller. The body was not simply bracing before every trial, the way you might tense before any surprise. It braced more before the trials that were about to be disturbing, as though some part of the volunteer already knew which kind of future was seconds away, when no mind on earth and no machine had yet decided. One experiment is a curiosity. Raiden knew this better than anyone, which is why the next chapter of this story does not happen in Las Vegas. It happens in Amsterdam. Dick Bierman, a psychologist at the University of Amsterdam, a careful, methodical researcher with no appetite for wishful thinking, read Raiden's protocol and did what a scientist is supposed to do. He tried to make the effect go away. He rebuilt the experiment with his own equipment, his own randomization, his own volunteers, hunting for the flaw, the leak, the artifact that would explain the early response. The effect did not go away. The skin rose early in Amsterdam, just as it had risen early in Las Vegas, stronger before the emotional futures than before the calm ones. Bierman went further. In later work, he put volunteers in a brain scanner and found patterns of brain activation that appeared to differ before emotional versus calm images were shown, before the selection was made. Other laboratories followed, in Europe and America, with variations: sounds instead of images, gamblers anticipating wins and losses, different sensors, different designs. Not every attempt succeeded. Some found nothing, and honesty requires you to know that and to remember it for later. But across the field as a whole, the early response kept surfacing in enough independent hands that it earned a name. Presentiment, from the Latin praesentire, to feel before. Notice that the word already existed. Long before the laboratories, the language had quietly minted a term for the feeling that arrives ahead of its cause, because people kept having the experience and kept needing a word for it. You have used its plainer cousins all your life. I had a feeling. Something told me. I knew before I picked up the phone. And you have likely had at least one of the moments that no one ever forgets. The sudden, sourceless weight in the chest on an ordinary afternoon. And then, later, the call. And the two events fusing in memory into a single unbearable fact. The skeptic's explanation of such moments is real and must be respected. We built it ourselves, at full strength, minutes ago. Most of those moments are coincidence dressed in meaning. Most. But the laboratory data forces a question the skeptic's account cannot quite close. If the body genuinely leans toward emotional futures by a few seconds under controlled conditions, then the folk experience is no longer made entirely of coincidence. Somewhere in the pile of anecdotes, mixed invisibly among the false alarms, there may be real signals, moments when the storm in the chest was the genuine article, arriving early. You will never be able to sort your own memories into the two piles. No one can. But the piles may both exist. That is what the instruments suggest, and it changes, just slightly, forever, how you hold the phrase, "something told me." Then it reached the heart. In 2004, a research team led by Rollin McCraty published a pair of studies that took the same design and pointed the sensors at the cardiovascular system. Volunteers watched randomly selected calm or emotional images, while their heart rhythms were recorded continuously. And the heart, like the skin, appeared to change before the image appeared. Its rhythm deflecting seconds ahead of an emotional picture, and doing so differently than before a calm one. But the detail from that work that has haunted researchers since is stranger still. When McCraty's team compared the timing of the signals, The heart appeared to register the difference before the brain did. Read that again slowly, the way it deserves. In these recordings, the organ in your chest seemed to receive the future first, and the brain seemed to follow. Whatever this effect is, if it is real, it does not begin in the thinking mind. It begins lower, older, in the body's deep machinery, in the systems that were keeping animals alive for hundreds of millions of years before anything like a thought existed. Which is exactly where the old phrase always located it. Not I calculated something was wrong. Not I reasoned it out. I felt it, we say, and we touch our chest when we say it. Every language on earth seems to know this address. In English, a gut feeling, a sinking heart. Elsewhere the liver knows, the stomach speaks, the heart tightens. Wherever human beings have talked about the knowing that arrives without reasons, they have pointed below the head. For a long time, science treated this as mere metaphor, folk poetry, about what were really just brain states. Then the physiology caught up, and it turned out the folk were being literal. Your gut is wrapped in a mesh of hundreds of millions of neurons. A genuine second nervous system. Your heart sends more signals up to the brain than the brain sends down to the heart. The body is not a puppet dangling from the skull. It is a chorus of systems that sense and decide and remember, mostly without asking your permission, and the conscious mind is less the author of your reactions than their last reader, receiving the news after the body has already gone to press. That much is established textbook science, no controversy at all. The presentiment experiments make one addition to it, and the addition is the mystery that this deep bodily chorus seems to begin its music not just before your awareness, which would be ordinary, but before the event itself, which should be impossible. The storm you feel before the sky changes. The old phrase was pointing at the right window all along. We just never imagined the window might open onto the future. So, hold what we have so far in one breath. A body wired to sensors, futures chosen by a random process at the last moment, unknowable in advance by any mind or machine. And in the seconds before those futures arrive, the skin rising, the heart shifting, the pupil widening, more before the emotional futures than the calm ones. Measured in Las Vegas, rebuilt and confirmed in Amsterdam, extended to the heart in 2004. Named presentiment, the feeling that comes before, that is the core of it. Everything else tonight is the deepening of it, because scattered experiments, however striking, can always be dismissed one at a time. This one had a small sample, that one had a clever confound. The real question is what happens when you gather every experiment, the successes and the failures together, and weigh them as one body of evidence. In 2012, a researcher named Julia Mossbridge at Northwestern University, together with colleagues, did exactly that. They collected 26 presentiment experiments spanning more than 3 decades from multiple independent laboratories, including the ones that found nothing, and ran a formal meta-analysis, the same statistical machinery medicine uses to decide whether a drug works. The result? A small but consistent effect, present across the field. That did not depend on any single laboratory or any single method, and when the combined statistics were computed, the odds that this pattern was a fluke of chance came out beyond 1 billion to 1. The paper passed peer review and was published in Frontiers in Psychology, a mainstream journal. The authors chose their words with almost painful care. They did not claim the future causes the present. They reported an anomaly, that human physiology appears to anticipate unpredictable emotional events by seconds, and that the effect, whatever it is statistically real in the accumulated data. An anomaly with odds beyond 1 billion to 1, sitting in the published literature, politely refusing to leave. Let the number breathe for a moment. Because numbers this large stop meaning anything unless you slow down. 1 billion to 1 is not "this is probably real." 1 billion to 1 is the kind of odds at which, in any other corner of science, the conversation about weather simply ends. If a new drug showed its effect at 1 billion to 1 against chance, it would be in pharmacies. If a new particle showed itself at those odds, there would be champagne in the control room. The discovery of the Higgs boson was announced at odds of roughly 3.5 million to 1, and the physicists called that certainty. The presentiment meta-analysis sits hundreds of times beyond that threshold, and yet no champagne, no headlines, no textbook chapter. Why? Because in science, and this is fair, extraordinary claims are held to a different standard, and there is no claim more extraordinary than an arrow of influence pointing backward through time. The physicists had a theory that predicted the Higgs. The anomaly has no accepted theory at all, and an effect without a mechanism, however statistically loud, sits in a kind of scientific purgatory. Too solid to dismiss, too impossible to accept. Hold both truths at once, because both are true. The data, taken at face value, is overwhelming, and the resistance to it is not mere stubbornness, it is science protecting the deepest load-bearing wall in its house, the one marked causality, the rule that causes come before effects. Something has to give. Either the accumulated data of 3 decades contains a flaw so subtle that no one has yet put a finger on it, or the wall has a crack. There is no third, comfortable option. That is what makes this story worth 2.5 hours of your night. Now ask the obvious question. If this is in the literature, if the odds are what they are, why have you never heard of it? Why is it not in the textbooks, on the news, in your feed? And here we arrive at the part of the story that is about science itself as a human institution with human reflexes. Because the scientific establishment did not, for the most part, refute these experiments. Refuting them would have required engaging with them, rerunning them at scale, publishing the failures and the successes, and letting the data decide. What most of the establishment did instead was quieter and older and more human. It looked away. The effect was filed under a word that functions in science the way a locked door functions in a house: parapsychology. And for decades, that label was enough. Careers were not built studying presentiment. Careers were endangered by it. Journals returned papers unread. Funding bodies smiled and declined. A handful of researchers kept the work alive at the margins, publishing carefully, replicating patiently, while the mainstream walked past the anomaly, the way you walk past a stranger you have decided not to see. This is not a conspiracy. No one organized it. It is something more ordinary and more sobering, a reminder that science is done by people, and people have taboos, and the data does not care about either. The measurements sat in the record, year after year, waiting. There is a book that captures this whole strange standoff, though it was written about other revolutions. Science, the historians of it tell us, does not usually advance by cheerful open-mindedness. It advances funeral by funeral, paradigm by paradigm, and between paradigms, anomalies are not investigated, they are endured. The measurement that does not fit is not disproven, because disproving it would dignify it. It is simply not discussed. The way a family does not discuss the door at the end of the hall. Every field has such doors. This is one of psychology's, and it stayed shut for a simple, honest reason that deserves to be said without sneering. The researchers who ignored it were not fools or cowards. They were people with finite careers and finite funding, looking at an effect that, if real, would demand the rewriting of physics and deciding, reasonably, that the odds favoured a hidden flaw over a broken universe. Reasonable, human, and, if the meta-analyses are right, wrong. So gather the threads once more, slowly, before the door gets kicked open. Palms, sweating for pictures that do not yet exist. Las Vegas, 1997. The effect rebuilt and confirmed in Amsterdam. The heart deflecting early. and earlier than the brain, 2004, 26 experiments, 3 decades, combined at Northwestern in 2012, beyond 1 billion to 1 against chance. A word already waiting in the language, presentiment, to feel before, and an establishment holding the door shut with both hands. And then, in 2011, the waiting ended, because a respected psychologist at Cornell University decided to drag the whole question into the brightest room in his field, and the field went to war. That story, the most spectacular scientific fight of its generation, is where we go next. But first, the mirror. 24 centuries before the first electrode, a man stood trial in Athens for his life. And in his defense, he said something strange. Socrates, the founder of everything we call Western philosophy, the man who taught the world to trust nothing but reason, told the jury that all his life he had been accompanied by an inner voice, a small divine sign, his daemonion, and he described how it worked with the precision of a man reporting an instrument. The voice never told him what to do. It never gave arguments, never explained, never predicted in words. It only ever stopped him, a wordless resistance rising in him at the threshold of certain actions, and he had learned, over a lifetime, that when it rose, the action led to harm, and when it stayed silent, the way was safe. He did not command it. He could not summon it. It arrived before his reasoning, beneath his reasoning, and he, the most rational man in Athens, had come to trust it with his life. On the day of his trial, he told the jury, the voice had stayed silent from the moment he left his house, and from its silence he concluded, calmly, that whatever was coming, even death, was not to be feared. Now hold that description next to the laboratory, a signal that arrives before conscious thought, that carries no words and no reasons, that responds to what is coming rather than what is present, that rises before harm and rests before safety. The terminology differs, the structure is identical, and let the break be said plainly, because this channel does not blur these lines. A 24-century-old inner voice is not laboratory evidence, and a structural parallel is not a proof. Socrates may have been describing nothing more than finely tuned unconscious judgment, a lifetime of pattern recognition wearing the mask of a spirit. But when the oldest report in the philosophical record and the newest curves out of the physiology lab draw the same shape, the shape itself becomes the mystery. Something in you that knows before you know. The ancients gave it names. The instruments give it curves. Neither can yet tell us what it is. And Socrates was not alone. He was only the best documented. Across the ancient world, the traditions kept independent records of the same inner instrument. The Hindu sages spoke of the Antaryamin, literally the inner controller, the knower seated within who perceives what the surface mind cannot. The Buddhist teachers distinguished ordinary reasoning from prajna, a direct, wordless knowing that arrives whole, before concepts, the way the body's alarm arrives before the image. The Hebrew scriptures locate understanding not in the head, but in the lev, the heart, and there God searches hearts, not brains. Christian tradition inherited that map and deepened it, teaching discernment of the heart, the practice of attending to inner movements, consolations and warnings that rise unbidden and prove wiser than argument. None of these traditions knew of the other's terms. All of them drew the same figure, a knowing in the human being that is deeper than thought, earlier than thought, seated in the chest rather than the head, and worthy, when properly attended, of trust. For centuries, the modern world filed all of this under poetry. The laboratories were not trying to vindicate it. Most of the researchers you have met tonight would wince at the suggestion. But data does not consult our filing systems. The curves rise where the traditions pointed, below thought, before the event, in the body's deep places. The break stays firmly on, parallels are not proofs, and reverence is not evidence. yet a pattern reported independently across every civilization and now flickering in the physiology of ordinary volunteers has earned something. Not belief, attention, and this is only the first thread. Because everything you have seen tonight, the rising skin, the shifting heart, the 1,000,000,000 meta-analysis, all of it was still living quietly at the edge of science, tolerated and ignored, until one man decided to end the quiet. Darrell Bem was not an outsider. He was one of the most respected experimental psychologists of his generation, a Cornell professor whose methods textbooks had trained the very people who would soon try to destroy him. And in 2011, at the height of his reputation, he submitted a paper to the most prestigious journal in his field, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, reporting 9 experiments of his own with more than 1,000 participants, showing that the anomaly you have just met was measurable not only in skin and heartbeat, but in memory and behavior itself. That people's responses seemed to be touched, faintly but measurably, by events that had not yet happened. The journal, bound by its own rules, could find no methodological grounds to reject it. The paper was published, and the explosion that followed did not just put presentiment on trial, it put the entire machinery of modern science on trial. Cracked psychology opened into a crisis it is still not fully healed from, and forced the deepest question of all out into the open, the one physics has been quietly dreading for a century. If the future cannot touch the present, why do the equations of physics refuse to say so? Why does the mathematics of time run just as smoothly backward as forward? And what did the strangest experiment ever performed, where a choice made now appeared to shape what light had already done in the past, actually mean? Your body answered 3 seconds early. Physics may be about to tell you why that is not impossible. Stay with me. The storm is closer than the sky admits. Your future is not behind glass. You feel that it is. You feel that what has not yet happened sits sealed away from you, unreachable, unable to touch your body or your night, and that the only thing pressing on this moment is the weight of everything already done. This is not a metaphor, that feeling is not in the laws of physics. Write down the fundamental equations that govern matter, the ones taught in every university on Earth, then reverse the direction of time inside them, and they remain perfectly valid. They describe a universe that runs backward as happily as forward. Physicists call this time symmetry, and it means the rule you feel in your bones, that causes must come before effects, is nowhere in the deep laws. We put it there ourselves, and in 2011, a Cornell professor with 1,000 participants decided to find out what happens when you take that omission into a laboratory. His name was Darrell Bem, and he was not a fringe figure. That is the entire reason the explosion was as large as it was. Bem was one of the most respected experimental social psychologists of his generation. A Cornell professor whose work on self-perception is standard curriculum, who had spent decades teaching other researchers how to design clean experiments and how to write them up. The people who would soon try to demolish him had, many of them, learned their craft from his textbook chapters. And in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, the most prestigious journal in his field, he published a paper titled Feeling the Future, reporting 9 experiments with over 1,000 participants, and the results said that ordinary people's responses were being influenced, faintly but measurably, by events that had not happened yet. His method had a kind of beautiful impudence to it. Bem did not invent exotic new tests. He took standard, boring, thoroughly validated experiments from mainstream psychology, the sort that have been run 10,000 times with predictable results, and he simply ran them backward in time. Consider the most famous example. There is a classic memory task. Give someone a list of words to study, then test them, then have them practice a random subset of those words afterward. Everyone knows practice improves recall. That is why the practice comes first. Bem reversed the order. Participants saw the words, were tested on all of them, and only then did the computer randomly select a subset for them to practice. The practice happened after the test. The random selection happened after the test. And Bem's question was whether the words that would later be practiced were remembered better in the test that came before. By every ordinary rule, the answer must be no. That is not a question, it is a punchline. The results said the words later practiced were recalled slightly, but statistically significantly better. Stay with how ordinary the machinery is. Because that is the whole point of the design. Bem did not build a temple of strange apparatus. He used the same word lists, the same recall scoring, the same statistical tests that appear in 1,000 unremarkable memory papers, and changed exactly one thing: the order of events. If the effect were an artifact of some exotic method, there would be an exotic method to blame. There is not. The method is the field's own, the one it trusts implicitly when the results are boring, and this is what made the paper so difficult to dismiss and so infuriating to receive. It was not an outsider waving a strange instrument. It was an insider holding up the field's own mirror and asking, politely, what everyone saw in it. Another of the 9 used erotic images and a simple guessing game. A participant faced 2 curtains on a screen and was asked to guess which one concealed a picture. Only after the guess did the computer randomly choose the position and randomly choose whether the image would be erotic or neutral. For neutral images, participants performed exactly at chance, 50%, as they should. For the erotic images, they were right about 53% of the time, 3 percentage points. In an ordinary psychology experiment, a 3-point effect would be unremarkable. Here it was a crack in the wall of the world, because the target had not been chosen when the guess was made. And notice the shape of the result, which is the same shape you have already seen. The effect appeared only where the emotional charge was. Neutral futures produced nothing. Charged futures produced the lean. The body, and now behavior, seemed to bend only toward futures that mattered. That detail deserves more weight than it usually gets, because it is the fingerprint that keeps appearing across every version of this research. In every laboratory, with every kind of sensor. Skin conductance, no lean before calm pictures, a lean before disturbing ones. Heart rhythm, the same asymmetry. Pupil dilation, the same. Guessing behavior, chance for neutral targets, above chance for charged ones. Whatever this effect is, it is not a general channel of information from the future, a little radio picking up tomorrow's news. It is selective, and it selects for emotional intensity, for the futures that would matter to a body trying to survive. And that is precisely the signature you would expect if the effect were biological rather than magical. A nervous system does not care about neutral images. It never has. It cares about threat, about sex, about food, about the events that changed whether your ancestors lived. If some faint anticipation exists in the machinery, it would be built where evolution built everything else, in the alarm system. Which means the phenomenon, if real, is not psychic in the sense the word usually carries. It is physiological. It is the ancient alarm, apparently ringing a few seconds before the fire. What happened next tells you more about how knowledge actually works than any philosophy lecture. The editors of the journal were not delighted. They subjected the paper to review by 4 independent reviewers, some of them openly hostile to the claim, and instructed them to hunt for the flaw. The reviewers hunted, and their conclusion, reported afterward with visible discomfort, was that the paper followed the standard methodological rules of the field. The randomization was proper. The statistics were the ones psychologists use every day. The sample sizes were larger than the field's norm. The analyses were the ordinary analyses. There was no rule Bem had broken. So the editors faced a choice that would have been almost funny if it were not so serious. Reject a paper that met every published standard, purely because they disliked the conclusion, and admit that the standards were never the real gatekeeper, or publish it and let a claim they considered absurd enter the most prestigious journal in their field. They published it, and in an accompanying editorial they essentially said, "We could find no flaw, we do not believe it." And we invite the field to explain what has happened here. The invitation was accepted with a violence no one anticipated. Pause on what that editorial admitted, because it is rarer than a strange result. A leading journal effectively said, "Our standards, applied honestly, produced a conclusion we consider absurd." There are only two ways to read that sentence, and both are serious. Either the standards are sound, and the absurd conclusion deserves a hearing, or the standards were never as sound as everyone believed, and a great deal of accepted knowledge is resting on them. Science had been operating for decades on the assumption that this dilemma would never arise, that the methods would never usher something impossible through the front door. The methods just had. And the reaction of the field, once the shock passed, was to attack not the intruder but the door, which was, in fairness, the more consequential target. Still, notice the asymmetry, because it says something about how anomalies actually die. Nobody ran BEM's protocol at scale with pre-registration and reported clean nulls before the demolition began. The demolition began first. The verdict preceded the evidence, which is precisely the crime the field was accusing him of committing. The response was one of the great scientific brawls of the century. Critics argued the statistical methods themselves were too permissive, that the standard toolkit of psychology could manufacture significant results out of noise if a researcher had enough freedom in how to analyze. Replication attempts began. Some failed to find BEM's effects. A large registered replication project reported nothing. BEM answered with a meta-analysis of 90 experiments from 33 laboratories in 14 countries, reporting that the overall effect survived. The argument over that meta-analysis continues to this day, and here the honest break must be applied hard, because this is where a dishonest storyteller would run past the difficulty. The BEM affair did not end with vindication. It ended with something stranger, and in its way, more important. When his critics dug into the statistical practices that had let his paper pass, they found that those practices were not unique to him. They were the field's ordinary habits, and they were badly broken. The result was the replication crisis, the discovery that vast swaths of published psychology, including famous, textbook, career-defining findings, could not be reproduced when others tried. BEM's paper became the crowbar that pried open his own discipline. He had proved, at minimum, one thing beyond dispute. Either the future touches the present, or psychology's methods were producing impressive results out of nothing. Both possibilities were revolutions. The field chose to believe the second, reformed itself painfully, and left the first hanging, unresolved, in the air. There is a version of this story told by believers in which BEM was a martyr, and a version told by skeptics in which he was a cautionary tale, and both versions are too tidy. Here is the untidy truth. BEM's specific results are genuinely disputed, and a reasonable person can look at the failed replications and conclude the effect is not there. That is a respectable position, and you should know it exists. But two things must be held alongside it. First, the tools used to attack him were the same tools that had produced much of his field's accepted knowledge, so the attack cut both ways and everyone knew it. Second, and more importantly, BEM's behavioral experiments are not the load-bearing wall of tonight's story. The physiological work came first, from different laboratories with different measures, and rests on a body responding rather than a person guessing. When the meta-analysis of presentiment was published at Northwestern in 2012, it deliberately excluded BEM's behavioral studies and analysed only the physiological ones, and the effect was still there. You could delete Darrell BEM entirely from this history, and the anomaly would remain. What he did was make it impossible to keep ignoring, at the cost of his own reputation, and, incidentally at the cost of forcing an entire discipline to become more honest. Historians of science may end up judging that a fair trade. So hold the state of play. Plainly, a Cornell psychologist ran standard experiments backward in time and got small, consistent, statistically significant results. The most prestigious journal in his field could find no methodological flaw and published under protest. Some replications failed, some succeeded, and a meta-analysis of 90 experiments across 14 countries reported the effect surviving, while critics disputed it. And along the way, the whole affair exposed that the discipline's methods were shakier than anyone admitted. Nothing here is settled, but notice what did not happen. Nobody found the flaw. Nobody produced the leak that explains presentiment away. 30 years of hunting, and the anomaly is still on the table, wounded, contested, and breathing. And this is where most treatments of the subject stop, with a shrug about how weird it all is, and that is a failure of nerve. Because the argument that has been running underneath every page of this controversy was never really about statistics. It was about a prior conviction, held by nearly everyone in the room, that the result must be wrong, because the result is impossible. Statistics were the language of the fight. Impossibility was the reason for it. So the honest next move is to put the conviction itself on the table and examine it, the way we examined confirmation bias. What exactly makes it impossible? Which law, precisely, does a palm sweating 2 seconds early break? Ask that question seriously, and the ground begins to move, because the answer turns out to be far less solid than the confidence with which it is asserted. Which brings us to the question that has been standing behind all of this, arms folded, waiting for us to notice it. Why do we find this impossible? Not implausible, impossible. What exactly, in our picture of reality, forbids the future from touching the present? Ask a physicist that question in a hallway, and you will get a confident answer about causality. Ask the same physicist in front of the equations, and something interesting happens, because the confident answer is not in the equations. Newton's laws run backward, work. Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism run backward, work. In fact, they come with a second family of solutions, called advanced waves, that travel backward in time, and physicists have historically discarded them by hand. Not because the mathematics forbids them, but because they seemed absurd. Quantum mechanics, at its core level, is likewise time-symmetric. In the fundamental laws, there is no arrow. The story of those discarded backward waves is worth a moment, because it shows how casually the assumption gets installed when physicists write the equations describing how light radiates. The mathematics hands back 2 families of solutions. One describes waves spreading outward from a source into the future, which is what we observe. The other describes waves converging inward from the future onto the source, and it is every bit as valid a solution to the same equation. Physicists call them retarded and advanced waves, and for a century the standard practice has been to keep the first and throw away the second, on the grounds that we do not see light converging out of the future onto light bulbs. That is a perfectly sensible thing to do. But it is a choice made by hand, on grounds of observation, not a consequence of the mathematics, and every physicist knows it. In the 1940s, 2 of the century's finest, John Wheeler and Richard Feynman, went the other way and built a theory of electromagnetism that deliberately kept both, using half of each, with the backward travelling waves doing real work in the formalism. It was published, taken seriously, and though it did not become the standard approach, no one ever showed it was wrong. This is the point that matters for tonight. The arrow you consider unbreakable is, in the fundamental theory, an editorial decision. The past does not look different from the future in the equations. Nothing in them says which way the film should run. So where does time's direction come from? The best answer we have is thermodynamic and statistical, and it is beautiful. and it does not do the job people think it does. The arrow of time arises from entropy, from the overwhelming statistical tendency of disorder to increase, which is why a cup shatters and never reassembles, why smoke spreads and never gathers. But entropy is a story about enormous collections of particles, about probabilities so overwhelming that they act like laws. It is not a fundamental prohibition. At the level of the individual particle, the individual interaction, the individual quantum event, the arrow simply is not there, which means that when you say the future cannot influence the present, you are not stating a law of physics. You are stating a statistical regularity that holds for cups and smoke and armies of particles, and you are extending it, without warrant, into the microscopic realm where the equations remain serenely indifferent to direction. That extension may well be correct, but it is an assumption, not a theorem. Make it concrete with the oldest example in the book. A cup falls from your kitchen counter and shatters, and you know with total certainty that you will never, in all your life, see the fragments leap up and reassemble into a cup. But ask why not, and the answer is not that physics forbids it. Every individual collision in that shattering is perfectly reversible. Run any one of them backward, and no law is broken. What forbids the cup from reassembling is counting. There are unimaginably more ways for the pieces to be scattered than to be a cup. So the scattered outcome wins by overwhelming numbers every time, forever. The arrow of time is a matter of odds, not of law, and the odds are so lopsided at kitchen scale that they feel like law. Now shrink the scene. One particle, one interaction, one quantum event. At that scale, the counting argument loses its force entirely, because there is no vast crowd of possibilities to swamp the reversed case. The arrow thins out, and in the equations governing that single event, it disappears completely. So when someone tells you the future cannot reach backward, ask which physics they mean. At the scale of cups, they are right, and spectacularly so. At the scale of the events happening inside your nerve cells, the honest answer is that nobody knows, because the law they are invoking was never a law down there. And in the 20th century, physicists began performing experiments that made the whole assumption feel very uncomfortable indeed. The most famous of them was conceived by John Archibald Wheeler, the Princeton physicist who named the black hole and taught a generation of the field's giants. In 1978, he proposed a thought experiment, and by the 1980s technology had caught up enough to actually perform it. To understand what it shows, you need the ordinary strangeness first. Send single particles of light, one at a time, toward a barrier with two slits, and let them land on a screen behind. If you leave both paths open, and do not check which slit each particle went through, the particles build up an interference pattern, bands of light and dark, the signature of a wave passing through both slits at once. If you place detectors at the slits and check which path each particle took, the interference vanishes. You get two simple clumps, the signature of particles going through one slit or the other. This is the central mystery of quantum mechanics, and it has been confirmed thousands of times. Whether light behaves as a wave or as a particle depends on whether you look, not on how hard you look, not on what instrument you use, on whether the information about the path exists anywhere in the world at all. Erase that information after the fact, and the interference pattern returns. Physicists have done this too, in what are called quantum eraser experiments, and the results are as advertised. The universe appears to care about what is known, and to leave undetermined what is not. Wheeler asked the question that turns the mystery into vertigo. What if you wait? What if the particle has already passed the slits, and only then, while it is in flight, after the crossing is complete, you decide whether to look? The particle has already committed, or so it seems. It has already gone through both slits, or through one. Surely your later choice cannot reach back and change what already happened. The experiment was performed, in various forms, with the choice made at the last possible instant, and later versions used random processes to make the decision so that nothing could anticipate it. The result, the particle's behavior always matched the choice made after it had already passed the slits. Choose to check the path, and it had gone through one slit. Choose not to, and it had gone through both, and the interference appeared. As Wheeler put it, in a line that has been unsettling physicists ever since, we have a strange inversion of the normal order of time. The phenomenon is not a phenomenon, he wrote, until it is an observed phenomenon. Wheeler then took his own idea and made it enormous, in the way that only he could. Forget the laboratory bench, he said. Consider a quasar, an object so distant its light has been travelling for billions of years, and consider a galaxy sitting between that quasar and us, its gravity bending the light around both sides, so that the ancient light reaches Earth by two different paths. That is a two-slit experiment the size of the visible universe, with a gap of billions of years between the crossing and the measurement. And Wheeler's point was ruthless. On Earth, tonight, an astronomer chooses how to configure the telescope. And the configuration chosen tonight determines whether that light behaves as having taken one path, or both, across a journey that finished before there was an Earth to point a telescope from. He was not claiming we changed the past. He was showing that our ordinary picture of the past as a completed film, already screened, cannot survive quantum mechanics. Something about what happened is not fixed until it is registered. In Wheeler's phrase, we are participators in bringing into being some of what has already, apparently, been. Hold that beside a laboratory in Las Vegas, where a palm dampened 2 seconds before a picture existed, and notice that we are no longer in different universes of strangeness. We are in the same one, at different scales. Now the break, and it must be firm, because this is the place where careless storytelling turns a real mystery into a false one. The delayed choice experiment does not let you send a message to the past. It does not let a person change history. Physicists insist on this, and they are right. The mathematics is clear that no usable information travels backward, which is why the results violate no principle of relativity and cause no paradoxes of the grandfather variety. If you look only at what you can do with it, nothing spooky has happened. But that careful statement leaves the strangeness exactly where Wheeler put it. What the experiment demonstrates is that in quantum mechanics there is no fact of the matter about what the particle did until the measurement is made, and the measurement can come afterward. The past, at the quantum level, is not a finished thing sitting in storage waiting to be read. Some of what we call the past appears to remain, in a precise technical sense, open until it is observed. That is not a claim about magic. It is the standard interpretation of a standard experiment, performed in laboratories in France and Australia and elsewhere. And it is why serious physicists have stopped speaking confidently about time's arrow at the fundamental level. And now the number that reframes everything you have heard tonight. There is a formulation of quantum mechanics developed by the physicist Yakir Aharonov, one of the field's genuine originals, and his colleagues, called the two-state vector formalism. It is not fringe. It is published in mainstream physics journals and taken seriously by working physicists. Its proposal is direct. To describe a quantum system completely, you need two wave functions, one evolving forward in time from the past, and one evolving backward in time from the future. In this formalism, the present moment is not produced by the past alone. It is the meeting place of two influences, one arriving from what has been, and one arriving from what will be. Aharonov's group derived from it a class of predictions about strange measurement outcomes, and those predictions have been confirmed experimentally. Sit with the shape of that, a serious, published, experimentally supported formulation of quantum mechanics, in which the future is a genuine contributor to the present. Not metaphorically. Mathematically, the physicists who work on it are not talking about premonitions. Most would be appalled by the association. and that must be said clearly. But the wall that made presentiment impossible, the wall marked the future cannot touch the present, is not the solid structure you were taught. It has doors in it, and physicists put them there, and some of the doors are ajar. And there is a third thing, more disturbing than either, which is what these ideas were invented for. Aharonov and his colleagues did not build a backward-in-time formalism because they wanted to rescue premonitions. They built it because quantum mechanics, taken straight, produces a measurement problem so severe that some of the century's best minds have preferred almost any strangeness to living with it. The theory tells you a system is in many states at once, and then you look, and it is in one, and nothing in the equations describes the transition. That is the crack at the foundation of the most successful theory in the history of science, and among the serious proposals for sealing it, several achieve elegance by letting influence run both ways in time. There is a formulation called the transactional interpretation, developed by the physicist John Cramer, in which every quantum event is completed by a kind of handshake between a wave sent forward from the emitter and a wave sent backward from the absorber, the future confirming the past before the event occurs. These are not the fantasies of outsiders. They are published attempts by physicists to make the mathematics behave, and what they have in common is that they buy coherence by paying with the arrow of time. So gather this halfway ledger. The deep equations have no arrow. The arrow we experience is statistical, a matter of counting, and it thins to nothing at small scales. Delayed choice experiments show the past is not settled until measured, and more than one serious formulation of quantum mechanics requires the future to participate in the present. That is the terrain the presentiment data landed in. Not a fortress with no doors, a house whose foundations the builders are still arguing about. Which brings us to the strangest thing physics has to say about time, and to a place where the oldest traditions were waiting long before Einstein. In relativity, time is not a universal river flowing at one rate for everyone. It is a dimension, woven with space into a single fabric, and the mathematics treats past, present, and future as equally real regions of that fabric. There is no moving now in the equations. The now you feel is not a feature of the physics. This picture is often called the block universe, and Einstein himself drew the conclusion in a letter written near the end of his life, consoling the family of his oldest friend. For those of us who believe in physics, he wrote, the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. Now set that beside what the contemplative traditions have been saying for millennia, that eternity is not endless time, but the absence of it, that the divine sees all things in a single present, not by predicting, but by beholding, the way you see an entire painting rather than watching it appear stroke by stroke. That the mystics of every tradition report, in remarkably similar language, moments in which time stopped being a river and became a landscape. Boethius wrote it in a prison cell 15 centuries ago, defining eternity as the complete possession of unending life all at once, and he was not doing physics. He was trying to solve a theological puzzle. He arrived at the block universe anyway. He was not the only one to arrive there without equations. The Hindu traditions worked out, in their own vocabulary, that the succession we experience is a feature of the observer rather than of reality itself, and gave the appearance of unfolding time a name, treating the underlying real as timeless and the flow as something the mind supplies. Certain schools of Buddhist analysis dissolved the past and future into constructions, insisting that only the present moment has any standing at all, which is the block universe seen from the opposite side, but with the same target. Our naive picture of a moving now is wrong. The Christian mystics wrote of an eternal present in which the whole of a life is held at once, and Augustine, 16 centuries ago, sat down to ask what time actually is, and produced pages that physicists still quote with a kind of startled respect, concluding that past and future have no existence except in the soul, as memory and expectation. None of them measured anything. All of them concluded that the river you feel yourself floating down is not how things really are. And then, in the 20th century, mathematics arrived at the same conclusion from the opposite direction, and Einstein wrote his letter of consolation to a grieving family, and the physics and the mystics found themselves, uncomfortably for both, in the same room. The break goes on again, and hard, because this is exactly where a channel could sell you something. Relativity's block universe is a picture drawn from equations, contested among physicists themselves, and it does not say a mystic in a cell had access to space-time geometry. Boethius did not derive anything. He reasoned from theology and arrived at an image that happens to rhyme. A rhyme is not a proof. But notice what the rhyme costs the skeptic. If the block universe is right, if past and future are equally real regions of a single structure, then the question changes from how could the future influence the present, which sounds impossible, to why does the future influence the present so little, which is a physics question with a physics answer about entropy and scale. The impossible becomes merely difficult, and a body that leans 2 seconds early stops being a violation of the laws of nature and becomes an anomaly waiting for a mechanism. That is where we stand at the halfway point of this journey. The laboratories found a lean. The physics of time turns out to have no rule forbidding it, which leaves the hardest question of all, the one no laboratory and no equation has answered. The one that will decide whether any of this means anything at all. If some part of you really does receive the future, what part is it? Where does it live? How could a thing made of nerves and blood and salt water be touched by an event that has not occurred? And why, out of everything that will ever happen to you, does it seem to reach for only the moments that matter? And there is a personal question hiding inside the technical one, which is the reason any of this matters at 2 a.m. If the effect is real, it has been running in you your whole life. Every day, unnoticed, your body has been leaning a second or two into what was coming, and you have felt those leans and called them moods, nerves, indigestion, a bad night, the woman who could not explain why she took the other road, the man who woke at 4 with his chest tight and no reason, and learned the reason at 7. If any fraction of those moments are the real signal, rather than the noise, then the instrument has been in your chest all along, and the only thing missing was permission to take it seriously. That is what the last stretch of this journey is for, not to hand you a superpower, but to ask what it would mean to live in a body that receives a little of what has not yet arrived, and what the traditions, who assumed exactly this and built entire disciplines of attention around it, learned about listening. The instruments recorded the storm. Now we go looking for the window it comes through. Nobody knows how your body does this, not the researchers who measured your skin, not the physicists whose equations permit your reaction. Not one person alive can tell you the mechanism that lets your chest lean into a moment you have not reached yet. This is not a metaphor for scientific modesty, it is the literal state of the field. 30 years of measurement have produced a phenomenon with no explanation, and when the Northwestern meta-analysis established the effect statistically in 2012, it ended, in effect, with a shrug and a call for theory. The instruments say something arrives in you early. Nothing in biology says how. Not a nerve, not a receptor. Not a single structure in 500 years of anatomy that could plausibly do the job. And here is what makes this the most interesting hour of the whole journey. An unexplained result is not a failure. It is the most valuable object in science. Every revolution in the history of physics began as a measurement nobody could account for, sitting in the record, embarrassing everyone. So let us do what the researchers have to do. Let us go hunting for the window. Because if some part of you is genuinely receiving information from 2 seconds ahead, that information has to arrive somewhere, through some structure, in some form, and the human body is not an abstraction. It is meat and salt water and electrical impulse, thoroughly mapped, its senses catalogued down to the cell. There is no organ labelled unknown. Anatomy has been at this for 500 years, with scalpels, and then microscopes, and then scanners, and the inventory is complete. Eyes for light, ears for pressure waves in air, a nose and tongue for molecules, skin for temperature and touch, an inner ear for balance, and a dense network of internal sensors reporting on the state of your own organs. Every one of them is a transducer, a device for converting some physical thing out there into an electrical signal in here, and every one of them responds to something arriving from the past, because that is what signals do. There is no organ for the future. There is no nerve running the wrong way down the timeline. So either the effect is entering through a door we have already mapped and misunderstood, or through a door we have not yet found, or the effect is not real and there is no door at all. Tonight we take all three seriously, and we will not pretend the third possibility away, because a channel that flatters you is worth nothing at 2 a.m. It helps to remember how often the third possibility has won. The history of science is full of measured anomalies that turned out to be equipment. There was a famous case in which neutrinos appeared to travel faster than light, an observation that would have overturned relativity, announced by a careful team at one of the world's great laboratories in 2011. For months the world argued about what it meant. The cause turned out to be a loose fibre optic cable. That is the honest baseline you should carry into any anomaly. Most of them are cables. And yet the very same history contains the other outcome. The strange dark line in the sun's spectrum that nobody could match to a known element turned out to be helium. The faint hiss in a radio antenna that 2 engineers spent a year trying to eliminate, cleaning out pigeon droppings, turned out to be the afterglow of the Big Bang and won them a Nobel Prize. The wobble in Mercury's orbit that could not be explained by Newton and was blamed for decades on an undiscovered planet was the first observational crack in Newtonian gravity, and Einstein walked through it. Nobody can tell you in advance which kind you are looking at. The only honest method is to keep hunting the cable, publicly, for as long as it takes, and to keep the anomaly on the table while you hunt. Begin with the most likely answer, the one a careful scientist reaches for first, that the future is not involved at all. And the early response is ordinary anticipation wearing a costume. Human beings are extraordinary prediction machines. Your brain is, by the leading account in neuroscience today, not a passive receiver, but a relentless forecaster, constantly generating expectations about the next moment and correcting them against what arrives. Sit in an experiment for an hour, click through 100 trials, and your nervous system will learn the rhythm of that hour, whether or not you consciously notice the timing, the pacing, the feel of the sequence. If any subtle regularity existed in the ordering of the calm and disturbing images, your body could learn it and lean accordingly, and no one would need the future at all. This is called expectation bias, and it is the first thing any competent critic raises, and it is a serious objection, not a lazy one. It is worth understanding how deep this goes, because the predictive nature of your nervous system is one of the genuinely established facts of modern neuroscience, and it produces effects that feel exactly like precognition from the inside. Your brain does not wait for the world and then respond. It runs a continuous model of what is about to happen, and checks it against the incoming signal, and most of what you experience as perception is that model rather than the raw data. This is why you can catch a ball. Your motor system is not tracking where the ball is, which would be far too slow, but where it will be. It is why a familiar song makes your body move a beat ahead of the note. It is why walking down your own dark hallway feels different from walking down a stranger's. You are, at every moment, living a few hundred milliseconds ahead of yourself in a forecast. And a system like that, dropped into a laboratory, will absolutely try to forecast the experiment. It will pick up the hum of the equipment, the length of the pauses, the almost invisible regularities of the session. So the correct question is, never does the body anticipate, because of course it does. The question is whether anything remains after you have subtracted every anticipation that ordinary forecasting can explain. The entire architecture of these experiments exists to make that subtraction possible. The researchers knew this from the beginning, and the design fights back at exactly this point. The images are chosen by a random process, and in the better experiments by hardware random generators driven by physical noise, which are as close to genuinely patternless as engineering permits. There is no rhythm to learn, because there is no rhythm, but the objection has a subtler form, and it is the sharpest one in the whole literature. True randomness produces clumps. Flip a coin 200 times, and you will get runs of 5 and 6 heads. Genuine randomness looks streaky, which is exactly why people are bad at recognizing it. So a critic can argue that within a session, short runs of calm images might be followed by a disturbing one in patterns that a sensitive nervous system could half learn, and that certain ways of averaging the data could turn this into a fake early signal. This objection has been raised formally, in print, and it has teeth. The response from the field was to change the analysis, to use methods that are immune to that particular artifact, and to run studies where the randomization is generated afresh for every trial, with no session structure to learn. The effect in those studies was reduced in some hands and persisted in others, which is exactly the messy, honest picture you should expect from a real scientific controversy, and exactly what a channel selling certainty would hide from you. Then there is the possibility of leakage. That ordinary information about the coming image reaches the volunteer through an ordinary channel nobody thought to close. A hard drive that spins differently when loading a large image file. A faint sound from the equipment. A change in screen glow a fraction of a second before display. Subtle cues from an experimenter who knows the sequence. These are not paranoid worries. They are precisely how 100 famous anomalies have died, and the history of this field is littered with corpses of that kind. So the experiments were tightened, generation by generation. The experimenter was removed from the room and from any knowledge of the sequence. The images were preloaded so that no differential access occurred. The selection was moved to the last possible instant. The equipment was audited. And still, in the tightened designs, the early lean appeared often enough to survive into the meta-analysis. That is not proof. There could always be a leak nobody has imagined. But notice the shape of the argument at this point. The believer says the effect is real. The skeptic says there is an unknown flaw. Both are now claiming the existence of something nobody has produced. The difference is that the believer's unknown, at least, is permitted by the equations of physics. So the state of the hunt, in one breath. Expectation bias, addressed by true randomization, still argued over at the margins. Statistical artifacts from randomness clumping, raised seriously, partly answered, not entirely settled. Sensory leakage, hunted for 3 decades and progressively sealed off. Fraud, implausible across independent laboratories on multiple continents. And a residue that will not go away. Every ordinary door has been closed, most of them firmly, and something is still getting in, except for one door, and honesty requires that it be opened here, rather than at the end where it might look like a concession dragged out of me. It is called the file drawer problem, and it is the strongest surviving objection in the entire field. Imagine 100 laboratories run this experiment. By chance alone, some will find a positive effect, and some will find nothing. Now imagine which ones write it up. A null result is a boring afternoon, and an unpublished file. A positive result in a field this controversial is a paper worth fighting for. If the failures stay in the drawer, and the successes reach the literature, then a meta-analysis of the published record will find an effect that does not exist in the world, and everyone involved can be perfectly honest, and the conclusion can still be wrong. This is not a hypothetical worry. It has bent whole areas of medicine. The presentiment researchers know this, and the 2012 meta-analysis addressed it directly with the standard statistical tools. Estimating how many unpublished null studies would need to be hiding in drawers to erase the effect, and reporting that the number was implausibly large. Critics have disputed those estimates. And so, at the deepest level, the controversy comes down to an argument about invisible evidence, the skeptic pointing at studies nobody can see, the researcher calculating how many would be needed. There is no clean resolution available tonight, and anyone who offers you one is not being straight with you. Which forces the harder question. Suppose it is real. What would have to be true of your body for it to receive a signal from 2 seconds ahead? Notice, first, how small the requirement is. Nobody needs to explain visions or prophecy or detailed knowledge of tomorrow. The measured effect is a faint statistical lean in arousal, a shading of probability, the difference between 50 and 53%, the difference between a flat line and a line that rises a little sooner than it should. If you were designing the minimum possible violation of ordinary physics, you could hardly design one smaller. And the effect is emotional, which means whatever channel exists is wired into the alarm system rather than into cognition. It does not deliver facts, it delivers weather. A pressure change. That is the whole payload. Think about what that implies for the signal-to-noise problem in an ordinary life. Your body generates arousal all day long for 100 mundane reasons. Caffeine, a flight of stairs, a difficult email, a bad night, a memory surfacing, hunger. Against that constant churn, a faint 2-second lean toward an emotional future would be like a candle held up against a floodlit stadium. The laboratory solves this by averaging, run 1,000 trials, and the random noise cancels while a consistent tiny bias accumulates until it becomes visible in the statistics. But you cannot average your own life. You get each moment once, unrepeatable, drenched in noise. Which explains a fact that would otherwise be strange. If this faculty is real, why is it so useless? Why has no one ever built a life on it? Because a signal that only becomes visible after 1,000 repetitions is, for a single human being living forward, almost entirely inaccessible. It is not a power. It would be closer to a rumour your body carries, true on average, and unreliable on any given night. And the traditions, interestingly, said exactly that about the inner voice, long before anyone could measure it, that it is faint, that it is easily counterfeited by desire and fear, and that anyone who claims to hear it clearly and constantly should be regarded with suspicion. The honest researchers in this field have proposed candidate frameworks, and each of them is a promissory note rather than an explanation, and they say so. One line of thinking points at quantum processes inside the nervous system, arguing that if any biological structure operates in a regime where quantum effects survive, and if some formulations of quantum mechanics involve backward-in-time components, then a body could in principle be sensitive to them. The trouble is severe and must be stated. The brain is warm, wet, and noisy, the worst imaginable environment for maintaining delicate quantum states, and most physicists consider the timescales hopeless. Against that, there is a genuine and growing field called quantum biology, which has found that photosynthesis in plants appears to exploit quantum coherence to move energy with near-perfect efficiency, and that the magnetic compass of migratory birds may depend on quantum entanglement between electron spins in a protein in the eye. Living systems, it turns out, do sometimes use quantum effects in warm, wet, noisy conditions, which nobody expected either. That does not demonstrate anything about presentiment. It demonstrates that the argument from it is too warm and messy has failed before. The bird is worth a moment, because it is the best studied case, and it is genuinely astonishing. A European robin, weighing less than a bar of soap, migrates thousands of kilometers and navigates by sensing the Earth's magnetic field, a field so weak it barely deflects a compass needle. For decades, nobody could explain how a living body detects something that faint. The leading explanation now involves a protein in the retina called cryptochrome, in which an incoming photon creates a pair of electrons whose quantum spins are entangled, and the Earth's field nudges the relationship between those spins, altering the chemistry, and the bird, apparently, sees the field. Entangled electron spins, in a warm eye, in a living animal, used for navigation. 20 years ago, that sentence would have been laughed out of a seminar. So when someone tells you flatly that biology cannot exploit quantum effects, the correct response is that biology has already been caught doing it, twice, in plants and in birds, and that our confidence about what warm wet matter can and cannot do has a poor track record. That is not evidence for presentiment. It is a warning against the particular kind of certainty that would rule it out without looking. But there is a second framework, and it is the one that changes the shape of the question rather than answering it. Suppose the block universe picture is right, and past, present, and future are equally real regions of a single space-time structure. Then no signal needs to travel backward at all, because nothing is traveling anywhere. In that picture, your body at 9 o'clock and the image at 9 o'clock and 2 seconds are both simply features of the landscape, adjacent, correlated, part of a single connected fabric. And the question is no longer how did information get from the future to the past. It becomes, why is the correlation so weak? Why is the fabric so nearly one-directional? Why does the past shout at us and the future only whisper? And that is a physics question, of the ordinary kind, with an ordinary sort of answer waiting somewhere in thermodynamics and scale. The impossible has become the difficult. Notice what has happened to your intuition here. You were taught to picture time as a river and the future as water that has not arrived. If instead it is a landscape and you are walking through it, then the mountain ahead has been there all along, and feeling its shadow before you round the bend is not a violation of anything. It is just an unusually long shadow. Hold the breakdown for a moment on that image, because it is seductive, and I do not want to sell it to you cheaply. The block universe is a picture that many physicists accept and many others reject, and the argument is live. It rests on how one interprets relativity's treatment of simultaneity, and interpretation is exactly the word. The mathematics is agreed on. The picture drawn from it is not. There are serious physicists who hold that the present moment is genuinely special, and that the future does not exist in any sense, and they are not fools. So the correct statement is not, physics says the future is already there. The correct statement is that physics permits a picture in which it is, and that in that picture the presentiment anomaly stops requiring a miracle and starts requiring only an explanation. That is a much smaller claim, and it is the one I will defend. Nothing tonight has established that your body reads the future. What has been established is narrower and, I think, more interesting, that nothing we know forbids it, that something has been measured that looks like it, and that the reflex to call it impossible was never grounded in the physics people imagined it was grounded in. Let me tell you a story from the middle of the night, because we are deep in the hours now, and a single human moment does more than another equation. In the 1920s, a woman came to Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, and her analysis was stuck. She was a person of formidable intellect and formidable defences, everything reasoned, everything under control, and Jung could find no opening in her at all. One morning she was describing a dream from the night before, in which someone had given her a piece of golden jewellery, shaped like a scarab beetle. While she was speaking, Young became aware of a soft, insistent tapping at the window behind him. He turned. A flying insect was knocking against the glass from outside, trying to get into the darkened room, which is not what insects do. He opened the window and caught it in his hand. It was a scarabæed beetle, a rose chafer, the closest thing to a golden scarab that the Swiss climate produces. He turned to the woman and held it out and said, "Here is your scarab." And the account records that this broke her, in the way a thaw breaks a river. The rationalism cracked, and the analysis moved. Now, what do we do with that story? The skeptic has a complete and respectable answer, and it must be given. Beetles fly into windows every day. Dreams contain everything. And out of the countless dream and event pairs in a busy clinical life, one collision was bound to occur and be remembered forever, while 10,000 non-collisions vanished. That is the confirmation bias argument we built at the start of this journey, and it applies here with full force, and it may well be the truth of the matter. Jung himself was not naive about it. He spent decades trying to argue that such coincidences formed a category, which he called synchronicity, meaningful coincidence without causal connection, and he never produced anything a laboratory could test. He was a physician, not an experimentalist, and he knew the difference. Late in his life he collaborated with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, precisely because he suspected that whatever such moments were, the answer lay in physics rather than psychology. The collaboration produced a strange, difficult book and no experiments at all. Two of the most formidable minds of their century looked directly at this territory, agreed something was there, and could not build an instrument to catch it. That failure is part of the record too. What is worth carrying from the story is not evidence. It is a description of the felt shape of these moments, that they arrive precisely at the hinge of a life, that they carry emotional charge rather than information, and that they seem, to the person inside them, unmistakably addressed. That is the same fingerprint the instruments found. Not neutral facts arriving early. Charged moments. The alarm, not the almanac. And there is a humbler version of that story that almost everyone reading their own life will recognize, and it is worth putting beside the famous one, because it is the version that actually matters. A mother who cannot settle one evening and finds herself, without deciding to, standing in the doorway of her child's room. A man who turns the car around for no reason he can name. A woman who calls her father on a Tuesday, out of the ordinary rhythm of their calls, and reaches him for what turns out to be the last real conversation they have. In none of these cases does anyone see the future. There is no image, no message, no knowledge. There is only a pressure and a small adjustment of behavior, and afterward, sometimes, an outcome that makes the adjustment look uncanny. The overwhelming majority of such moments lead nowhere and are forgotten within the hour. That is the honest statistical shape of a life. But the ones that land are never forgotten, and they are never described as thoughts. They are always described as feelings, located in the chest, arriving without reasons, which is precisely the phenomenon the sensors were built to catch, and precisely the reason a laboratory in Nevada matters to a woman standing in a doorway at 11 at night. Which brings us to the strangest feature of the entire dataset, and the one nobody talks about enough. Why is the effect emotional? If some crack in time were leaking information backward, there is no reason it should care what the information is about. A crack does not select. Water does not choose which way to leak. Yet across every laboratory and every sensor, the lean appears before the images that would matter to a living creature, and not before the images that would not. Presentiment does not warn you about the colour of tomorrow's sky. It stirs before threat and before desire, before the things bodies have been built to survive. Whatever this is, it is not a channel in physics. It is a faculty in biology, and faculties are built by evolution, which means the question shifts again. What would such a faculty be for, and how could natural selection have shaped it? The answer, if there is one, is the same answer that explains every other alarm in you. A creature that felt danger a second and a half before it arrived would leave more descendants than one that did not. There is no need for the effect to be reliable, or conscious, or large. Across millions of years, a whisper of advantage is enough. Which would mean, if it is real, that this thing in your chest is not a spiritual gift or a paranormal talent. It is a survival organ, small and quiet and ancient, doing its job in the dark, exactly like the immune system, exactly like the startle reflex, exactly like everything else that keeps you alive without ever asking your opinion. And if that is what it is, then think about how it would actually show up in a life, not as visions, not as certainty, as reluctance, as the odd flatness that comes over you about a plan you were looking forward to, as the small resistance in your hand before you sign, as the inexplicable decision to take the other road, made so quickly and so quietly that you never registered making it, and would swear afterward it was nothing. That is the shape a faint emotional signal takes. When it reaches a conscious mind that has no channel for it, it arrives disguised as mood, as preference, as a whim, which means the great majority of these events, if they occur at all, would be entirely invisible even to the person having them, and only the rare, dramatic collision with a matching outcome would ever be noticed and remembered and told at family gatherings for 30 years. The instruments, in other words, are picking up something that ordinary life is structurally incapable of noticing. That is why the laboratory mattered. Not because the effect is stronger there, but because the sensors do not forget and do not decide in advance what is worth recording. And here the old traditions stop looking quaint and start looking like technical literature. Because if a faint faculty exists, one that speaks in pressure rather than words and is drowned by ordinary noise, then the practical question is not whether it is real, but how one would ever hear it. And that is precisely the question the contemplative traditions spent thousands of years working on. The Desert Fathers of early Christianity developed a discipline they called the discernment of spirits, and its manuals read, oddly, like instrument calibration. Notice the movements that arise in you. Distinguish the ones that come with agitation from the ones that come with peace. Do not act on the first impulse. Watch which impulses prove trustworthy over years and which do not. And above all, cultivate the stillness in which a faint signal can be noticed at all. The Quakers built an entire form of worship around waiting in silence for an inward prompting, and a decision-making procedure that refuses to move until the sense of the meeting settles. The Buddhist tradition trained attention to the body's subtlest sensations, teaching practitioners to detect arisings so faint that an ordinary mind never registers them. The yogic traditions of India devoted centuries to the same territory, describing a knowing they placed in the region of the heart rather than the head. What is striking, when you actually read these manuals rather than admire them from a distance, is how unmystical the instructions are. They are procedural. The desert monastics warned that the strongest impulse is the least trustworthy, that urgency itself is a warning sign, and that a genuine prompting will still be there tomorrow, while a false one will have evaporated overnight. Test it against time, they said, which is exactly what an engineer does with a noisy signal. Sample it repeatedly and see what persists. They warned against consulting the inner voice when agitated, angry, or hungry for a particular answer, because desire manufactures its own promptings, which is a precise description of expectation bias arrived at by monks with no statistics. The Quaker procedure requires a group to sit in silence with a question and refuse to decide until something settles, a discipline explicitly designed to prevent the loudest voice, internal or external, from winning. The Buddhist practice of scanning the body's sensations trains the practitioner to notice arisings at intensities most people never consciously register, which is calibration, and to observe them without immediately acting, which is separating detection from interpretation. Strip the theology from any of these, and you are left with the same protocol. Reduce the noise, do not trust urgency. Sample repeatedly, notice what is faint, act slowly. Whatever you believe about where the signal comes from, that is sound instrumentation. Now hold the breakdown while we look, because this is a place where it would be easy and dishonest to claim too much. None of those traditions measured anything. Their explanations, in terms of spirits and grace and subtle bodies, are not confirmed by a rising skin conductance curve, and nothing in this journey tonight validates any particular metaphysics. A structural parallel is not a proof, but there is something they can legitimately offer, which is not evidence, but engineering. Every one of those disciplines independently concluded the same three things about the faint inner signal: that it exists, that it is easily drowned by noise and by wanting, and that it can only be heard in stillness. Three cultures with no contact, no shared vocabulary, no common metaphysics, arriving at the same operating instructions. If there is a faculty of the kind the instruments hint at, faint, emotional, pre-conscious, then the traditions were not writing poetry. They were writing the user manual several thousand years before anyone found the device. So where does that leave you tonight, in the dark, with your own chest and your own history of moments you could never explain? Not with an answer, with something better and more honest, a genuine mystery standing in daylight with its documents in order. A measured effect that survived 30 years of hunting, a physics that turns out to have no law against it, a biology with no idea how it works, a pattern of emotional selectivity that points at evolution rather than magic, and a set of ancient disciplines that read, in this light, like practical instructions for hearing a signal science has only just learned to measure. Gather it once more, slowly, the way you would gather evidence you intend to sleep on. Skin conductance rising before disturbing images, Nevada, 1997. The effect rebuilt in Amsterdam by a man trying to kill it. Heart rhythm shifting early and shifting before the brain, 2004. 26 studies combined at Northwestern in 2012, beyond 1 billion to 1 against chance. With the file drawer objection acknowledged and contested. Standard experiments run backward at Cornell, published under protest, disputed to this day. Equations with no arrow of time. A quantum past that is not settled until it is measured. Formulations of physics in which the future contributes to the present. A biology with no mechanism and no shortage of precedent for surprises. And an emotional selectivity that points not at magic, but at the oldest alarm in the body. But we have not yet faced the hardest part, and I promised you we would. There are objections to everything you have heard tonight that I have not yet given their full strength, and they deserve the microphone, without excuses and without flinching. There is a question about what this would mean for your freedom if the future is already there to be felt, that goes deeper than any experiment. And there is the question you have been carrying since the first minute, the one no laboratory will ever settle for you. What to do tomorrow when the feeling comes and the sky is still perfectly clear and something in your chest says otherwise. That reckoning is where we go now. You already knew. That is the thing you came here carrying, and it has been sitting with you all night, under the experiments and the equations. Somewhere in your life there was a moment when your body told you something before you had any way to know it, and you have never been able to file that moment anywhere. You could not call it knowledge, because you knew nothing. You could not call it nothing, because it was not nothing. This is not a metaphor for a feeling. It is the exact experience that 30 years of instruments have been circling. And tonight, at the end, you deserve the honest accounting. Not the flattering one, the honest one. Because everything you have heard has objections waiting behind it, at full strength. And I promised you they would get the microphone before this night ends. And you should want them to. Consider what has been offered to you tonight. a claim that touches the structure of time, supported by measurements smaller than a whisper, in a field with a century of embarrassment behind it. If that claim cannot survive its own best objections, it deserves to fall. And you deserve to watch it fall, rather than be protected from the sight. The reason most treatments of this subject are worthless is not that they are wrong about the data, it is that they arrive already knowing what they want to be true, and then arrange the evidence, like furniture. Tonight the furniture gets rearranged by the other side, at full strength, and whatever remains standing afterward is worth something precisely because it was not spared. So here are the 4 hardest arguments against everything you have heard, made as well as I know how to make them, with no rescue attempted until each has been allowed to land. Here is the first, and it is the heaviest. The effect may simply not be real. Every piece of evidence in this story is small, a lean of a fraction of a percent, a 3-point deviation from chance, a curve rising a little sooner than expected. Small effects are exactly where science is weakest, because small effects are what you get when a subtle error runs through a large dataset. The file drawer problem is unresolved. Nobody can prove how many null results sit unpublished in how many drawers. The replication record is genuinely mixed, with serious registered attempts finding nothing. And the field carries a history it cannot escape. A century of paranormal claims that produced initially promising data and then dissolved under scrutiny. The card-guessing experiments of the 1930s that looked overwhelming and could not be repeated cleanly. The remote viewing programs funded by governments and quietly closed. The mediums, the spoon benders, the long parade of effects that shrank as the controls tightened. Every one of them had its meta-analysis. Every one of them had defenders pointing at odds against chance. Every one of them is gone. That pattern is real, and it is the strongest reason for caution that exists, stronger than any statistical argument, because it is a track record rather than a theory. A reasonable, informed, scientifically literate person can look at everything in this story and conclude that presentiment is a statistical mirage produced by the ordinary machinery of human error, and that person is not a fool, and I will not pretend otherwise to give you a better night. That position may well be correct. It is, on the plain arithmetic of scientific history. The more likely of the two, most anomalies dissolve, most revolutions never happen, and the safe bet is always on the loose cable rather than on the broken universe. If you leave tonight holding it, you have not misunderstood anything, and there is a specific reason to keep that possibility warm rather than merely tolerating it, which has to do with what happens to people who stop keeping it warm. The moment a person decides that a contested anomaly is settled fact, something shuts in them. They stop being able to hear the strongest objection, and then they stop being able to hear a weaker one, and eventually they are defending rather than investigating, and the whole apparatus of thinking has quietly reversed direction. It happens to skeptics as reliably as to believers. A man who has decided in advance that nothing strange can be true has stopped doing science just as thoroughly as the man who has decided everything strange is. The correct posture toward presentiment tonight is neither belief nor dismissal. It is the posture of a person standing in front of an unexplained measurement, interested, unpersuaded, and unwilling to look away, which is the only posture that has ever produced anything in the history of knowledge. If that feels unsatisfying, notice that the dissatisfaction is the point. Certainty is comfortable and cheap. This is neither. The second objection cuts at the part of the night that felt most convincing. It says the physics does not help as much as it appeared to. Yes, the fundamental equations are time-symmetric. Yes, delayed choice experiments show the quantum past is not settled until measured. Yes, there are respectable formulations in which the future contributes to the present. But every one of those physicists will tell you, firmly, that none of it permits usable information to travel backward in time, that the mathematics forbids signaling. and that the strangeness stays sealed at scales far below anything a nerve cell cares about. Pointing at time symmetry to explain a sweating palm is, on this objection, like pointing at the theoretical reversibility of molecular collisions to explain a shattered cup reassembling. It is technically true and practically irrelevant, and the gap between those two things is where a great deal of bad science lives. Every questionable claim of the last 50 years has reached for quantum mechanics at exactly this moment, borrowing the prestige of a genuine mystery to cover a hole in an argument, and audiences have been trained to nod when the word appears. You should not nod. The correct response to any invocation of quantum physics in support of a biological claim is suspicion, and that includes this one. Technically the law permits it, practically the universe never does it, and a body is a cup, not a photon. This objection deserves partial acceptance, and I give it. The physics does not explain presentiment. It never did. What the physics does is narrower. It removes the word impossible and replaces it with unexplained. Those are very different words, and only one of them ends an investigation. Consider how much work the word impossible has been doing in this story. It was the reason the establishment did not investigate, the reason journals did not publish, the reason careers were not built. The reason a measurement with odds beyond 1,000,000,000 to 1 sat in the literature for a decade, attracting less attention than a mediocre study on memory. Nobody had to disprove presentiment, because everyone knew it was impossible, and when you go looking for the law that makes it so, you find a statistical regularity about cups and smoke that nobody has ever demonstrated applies to the events inside a nerve cell. That is not a small correction. In science, the difference between impossible and merely unexplained determines whether a question gets funded, staffed, and attacked properly for 20 years, or whether it sits in a drawer with the word parapsychology written on the front. Nothing about the palm sweating early has been explained tonight, but the sentence "this cannot happen" has been downgraded to "we do not know how this could happen," and if the history of the field is any guide, that downgrade is where every real discovery begins. The third objection is not scientific at all, and it may be the most important. It says that even if every measurement is exactly right, it changes nothing about your life. A statistical lean of 2 seconds, invisible to you, unusable, unreliable, is not a gift, not a guidance system, not a message. You cannot act on it. You will never know when you are having one. Building any part of your life on it would be a mistake, and worse, it opens a door to a whole industry of people who will happily sell you the idea that your feelings are prophecies, that a bad mood about a flight is a warning, that your anxiety is wisdom. That industry is real, and it does harm, and everything in this story could be used as fuel for it. So let this be said as plainly as I know how. Nothing measured in any laboratory in this field gives you the ability to predict anything. If you take one practical instruction from tonight, let it be that anyone who tells you they can teach you to read the future is not describing this science. The finding is small, unconscious, and honest. The claims made in its name are usually none of those things. There is a specific harm worth naming, because it lands on the people least able to afford it. If you tell an anxious person that their feelings might be premonitions, you have not given them a gift. You have given their anxiety a costume and a promotion. Anxiety already generates dread with no object. That is its defining feature. And the sufferer already half suspects the dread means something. Tell them it might, and the ordinary 3 a.m. fear about a family member becomes a possible warning that must be acted upon, and then the next one, and the next, and a life narrows around the management of signals that were never signals. The presentiment research says nothing that supports this. What it describes is unconscious, invisible from the inside, and detectable only by averaging thousands of trials, which means that any feeling you can actually notice and name is, by the standards of this research, almost certainly not it. That is not a disappointing footnote. It is the most practically important sentence in this entire journey, and if it is the only thing you carry away, you will have taken the right thing. There is a fourth objection, quieter than the others and harder to answer, which comes from evolution itself. If a faculty like this exists, and it confers even a whisper of survival advantage, then across hundreds of millions of years, natural selection should have amplified it enormously. Sensitivity that helps you live gets sharpened, generation after generation. That is what selection does. Eyes went from light-sensitive patches to instruments that can register a single photon. So why is this signal still so faint that it takes 1,000 laboratory trials to see it? Why do we not all have a reliable 2-second warning, honed to a blade? 3 answers are available, and none is satisfying alone. Perhaps the effect is not real, which explains the faintness perfectly, and remains the simplest hypothesis. Perhaps it is real, but physically capped, a leak whose size is set by the structure of time rather than by biology, so that no amount of selection could widen it. Or perhaps it was amplified as far as it could be, and what we are measuring is the sharpened version, and 2 seconds of statistical lean is simply what a body gets. The honest answer is that nobody knows, and that the objection is a good one, and that any account of presentiment which cannot eventually explain its own weakness is incomplete. So what survives all 4? Something smaller than a revolution, and larger than nothing, and it is worth holding carefully. First, a body of measurement, 30 years deep, across independent laboratories on multiple continents, reporting that human physiology leans toward emotionally charged events a few seconds before those events are determined, contested, unexplained, and still on the table. Second, a physics that contains no law forbidding it. Not a violated principle, not a broken equation, not a single fundamental law that says the future may not touch the present, only a statistical regularity about crowds of particles that nobody has shown applies inside a cell, alongside several serious formulations that would accommodate the anomaly without strain. Third, a biology with no mechanism, in a century that has already caught living systems using quantum effects twice, in plants and in birds, after confidently declaring it impossible. And fourth, and this is the one nobody can take from you, the universal human experience of the feeling that arrives before the reason, reported in every culture, every century, every language on earth, which the traditions took seriously enough to build disciplines around, and which the modern world dismissed without ever examining. The instruments have not proved the traditions right. They have done something more modest and more interesting. They have made it no longer respectable to laugh. Hold the whole of it once, slowly, the way you would hold something you intend to keep. A volunteer in a chair in Nevada in 1997. Electrodes on 2 fingers, palms dampening for a photograph that the computer had not yet chosen. A skeptical researcher in Amsterdam rebuilding the experiment to kill it, and failing. Heart rhythms in 2004 deflecting early, and deflecting before the brain did, which put the first receiver below the neck. 26 studies gathered at Northwestern in 2012 and weighed together, beyond 1 billion to 1 against chance, with the strongest counter-argument, the unpublished failures, acknowledged and contested rather than hidden. A Cornell professor running the field's own standard experiments backward in time and publishing over the objections of a journal that could find no flaw. Equations that contain no arrow. A quantum past that stays open until it is measured. Serious formulations in which the future contributes to the present. A biology with no mechanism, in a century that has twice caught life doing quantum tricks it was told were impossible, and underneath all of it, in every culture and every century, the same reported human experience, the knowing that arrives before the reasons, and always in the chest. And here, at the deepest point of the night, Notice what the traditions and the laboratories actually agree on, because it is not what either side expected. 3 claims, from theology, from philosophy, from the contemplative manuals, that there is a knowing in the human being that is older and deeper than thought, that it speaks in the body rather than in words, that it must be listened for in stillness, because it is faint and easily counterfeited by fear and desire. And 3 structures, from the laboratories, that the earliest response measured is physiological rather than cognitive, that it appears in the heart and the skin before it appears in the brain, that it is so small it can only be found by averaging away the noise. The terminology differs, the structure is identical, and before that convergence is waved away as inevitable, notice how easily it could have failed. The traditions could have located the inner knowing in the head, where every culture locates thinking, and the instruments would then have found the heart and the skin, and the parallel would have collapsed. They could have described it as loud and reliable, a voice giving instructions, and the data showing a signal so faint it requires 1,000 trials, would have contradicted them flatly. They could have said it delivers facts, names, dates, and the finding that it responds only to emotional charge and never to neutral information would have refuted them. On every one of these forks, the ancient descriptions could have gone the other way, and on every one of them they went the way the instruments later went. That is not proof of anything metaphysical, and I will not dress it up as one, but it does suggest that the people writing those manuals were reporting observations rather than inventing consolations, that they were looking at something and describing what they saw, using the only vocabulary an age without instruments had available. They were empiricists working with a single instrument, attention, turned inward, for a lifetime. And the break goes on, one last time, firmly. A structural parallel is not a proof, and nothing tonight has demonstrated that the ancient descriptions were describing this. But a channel that has spent 3 hours refusing to overclaim has earned the right to say the honest thing at the end. 2 entirely independent ways of investigating a human being, separated by 2,000 years and every possible assumption, went looking for the deepest layer of a person and came back with the same report. Something in there knows before you do. It is quiet, and it lives below the neck. There is an implication in that sentence that takes a moment to land, and it is the emotional center of everything tonight. We have spent 400 years building a picture of the human being in which the mind sits in the head, reasoning, and the body below is a well-engineered vehicle carrying it around. Every institution we have built assumes it. We educate the head, we argue with the head, we call the head the self, and treat the rest as transport. And the last few decades of research have been quietly dismantling that picture from every direction at once. The gut, with its hundreds of millions of neurons, the heart sending more signals up than it receives down, the immune system making decisions no thought is party to, the sleeping brain doing its most important work in your absence. Now add a lean toward what has not yet happened, arriving in the skin and the heart before it arrives anywhere you could call you. The self that thinks is not the whole self, and may not even be the first to know. Something more distributed, older and quieter, is doing a great deal of the living. And when the traditions insisted that wisdom is seated in the heart, they were not being sentimental about an organ. They were reporting, from the inside, the same architecture the instruments are now finding from the outside. Which raises the question you have been carrying since the physics, whether or not you put words to it. If the future can be felt, is it already fixed? Are you free? This is the oldest question in philosophy, and it will not be settled tonight. But the honest answer is more comforting than people expect. Notice that nothing in the presentiment data suggests a determined future. The effect is statistical, not certain. The volunteers' bodies leaned toward what was probable, and the images themselves were generated by quantum-level randomness, which is the least determined thing in the known universe. If your body can register a coming event that a random process has not yet finalized, then what it registers is not a fixed fact. It is a probability, a weather front, a tendency in the fabric. And a tendency is exactly the kind of thing a free being can lean into or lean away from. The block universe, if it is real, does not make you a passenger. The mathematics that treats past and future as equally real also contains you, choosing, as part of its structure. You are not being carried down the river. You are part of the landscape, and your walking is one of the things the landscape is made of. The traditions worked this exact problem, and worked it harder than we do, because for them it was urgent. If a divine intelligence knows what you will do tomorrow, in what sense do you choose it? Boethius, writing in a cell while awaiting execution, produced the answer that shaped 1,000 years of Western thought, and it is worth hearing tonight, because it is almost precisely the block universe argument. Foreknowledge, he said, is the wrong word, because it imagines the divine sitting in the past, peering forward. Eternity is not a very long time. It is the absence of succession, the whole of things held in a single present. And seeing a thing does not cause it. You watching a man walk down a road does not compel his steps, even though your seeing makes it certain that he walks. Therefore, he concluded, the future can be entirely known and entirely free, and there is no contradiction, only a confusion produced by imagining eternity as a lot of time. The Hindu traditions worked the same territory with different tools, distinguishing the vast structure of consequence from the freedom of the one acting within it. None of this is physics, and none of it is proof. But notice that when human beings have thought most carefully about a knowable future, the conclusion they keep reaching is not fatalism. It is that being known and being free are not opposites, and that the sense of contradiction comes from a picture of time that was probably wrong to begin with. And this is the same threshold every one of these investigations arrives at eventually, which by now you will recognize. When we followed the brain through the moment of death, we found precise measurements and complete silence about what they meant. When we asked why pain exists, biology explained the alarm and had nothing at all to say about the agony that exceeds it. When we traced the atoms in your hands back to dying stars, the facts were astonishing and refused to tell you how to feel about them. When we asked what your brain does every night while you are not there, we found a body that maintains you in your absence, and no answer to what it means to be a creature like that. Tonight is the same shape again. The universe is generous with facts and silent about their significance. It will show you exactly what your skin did 2 seconds early and leave the meaning entirely to you. That silence is not emptiness. And there is a pattern across all of these investigations worth naming out loud, now that we are at the end of another one. Every time we have looked closely at something entirely ordinary, something you do every day without a second thought, it has turned out to be far stranger than the exotic things we usually chase. A night's sleep, a moment of pain, a tear, and tonight, a hunch, the most dismissible experience in the human catalogue, the thing you apologize for having. Look at it with instruments, and it becomes a 30-year controversy, touching the foundations of physics. This keeps happening, and there is a reason. Your attention is built to filter out the constant and flag the novel, which is efficient and mostly correct, and has one catastrophic side effect. The most fundamental facts of your existence, the ones present every day, are precisely the ones you have been trained not to see. The extraordinary is not somewhere else. It is not in exotic phenomena at the edge of physics, or in states available to a few. It is distributed through the ordinary furniture of your life, waiting in the things you do without noticing, and the only requirement for finding it is the willingness to look at something familiar as though you had never seen it before. That silence, where the facts stop and the meaning begins, is not emptiness. It is the space where a person becomes responsible for their own understanding, which is the only place understanding has ever come from. So, what do you do with this tomorrow when the sky is clear and something in your chest says otherwise? There are two failure modes, and almost everyone lives in one of them. The first is obedience, treating every wordless feeling as a message, reorganizing a life around moods, cancelling the flight because of a dream. That way lies superstition, and for anxious people, genuine damage. The second is dismissal, which is the respectable failure, the one our education trains into us, overriding every signal that cannot produce its credentials in words until the channel goes quiet from disuse. Most of the people listening tonight were raised in the second, and it costs more than anyone admits, because a great deal of what your body knows will never be able to explain itself. So, not obey it. The signal, if it exists, is faint and easily counterfeited, and every tradition that took it seriously said the same thing. The loudest inner voice is the least trustworthy. And urgency is a warning sign rather than a credential. Not ignore it either, which is what most of us have been trained to do, because we were taught that only reasons count, and a feeling without a reason is noise to be overridden. The traditions had a third instruction, and it is the one worth carrying out of tonight. Notice it. Simply that. When the flatness comes over a plan, when the hand hesitates before the signature, when you find yourself standing in a doorway with no idea why, do not obey and do not dismiss. Register it. Let it sit. See whether it is still there tomorrow, because the false ones evaporate overnight and the real ones do not. That is the entire practice, and it is small enough to actually do, which is the only reason it is worth giving you. Practices that require a retreat and a new vocabulary are abandoned by Thursday. This one asks for a pause and a night's patience. This costs you nothing, requires no belief, and contradicts no science. And notice that the protocol works even if presentiment is entirely false, which is the best test of any practical advice. Suppose the effect is a statistical mirage, and there is no channel from the future at all. Your body is still an instrument of extraordinary sensitivity, running 4 billion years of pattern recognition below your awareness, registering micro-expressions on a face you consciously read as friendly, detecting the wrongness in a familiar room before you can say what moved, computing risk from 1,000 cues too subtle to name. All of that is uncontroversial, established, textbook, and all of it reaches you the same way the disputed signal would, as a feeling in the chest with no reasons attached. Which means that the practice of noticing the wordless signal, refusing to obey it instantly, and checking whether it survives the night, is sound advice under either interpretation. If presentiment is real, you are attending to a faint anomaly. If it is not, you are attending to the most sophisticated pattern recognition system on the planet, which happens to report in the only language it has. Either way, you are doing what the desert monks and the Quakers and the Buddhist teachers arrived at independently, thousands of years before anyone measured a rising curve in Nevada, reducing the noise, distrusting urgency, sampling twice, and moving slowly. Tonight, when you close your eyes, your body will keep doing what it has done every night of your life. The heart will go on with its own rhythm, faster or slower than you asked. The skin will register things you will never consciously notice. And somewhere in that quiet machinery, if 30 years of instruments are telling the truth, something in you will lean, very slightly, toward what has not yet arrived. You will not feel it. You never have. Not once, in all the years, has the leaning ever reached the surface where you could catch it. It has been happening all along, through every year of your life, beneath every decision you thought you made with reasons. Think of the ones you cannot account for, the job you almost took and did not, for a reason you could never explain to anyone, including yourself. The person you trusted immediately, against all the evidence available at the time, and were right about. The evening you went home early, We tell these stories as though we had reasons, because a life narrated without reasons sounds like a life out of control, and so the mind supplies them afterward, tidily, and we believe our own account. But the research on decision-making, entirely mainstream and uncontroversial, has been showing for decades that the body commits before the reasons arrive. That arousal shifts before the choice is conscious, that people with damage to the emotional centers of the brain become unable to decide anything at all, despite perfect reasoning. You have never been a mind choosing. You have always been a whole creature leaning, and then explaining. Tonight's anomaly, if it holds, adds one improbable clause to that established sentence, that some of the leaning may be toward what has not yet come. That is not a frightening thought, though it may take a moment to stop being one. It means you are not a mind sitting on top of a machine, issuing orders. It means the borders you were taught. Between the self that thinks and the body that carries it, between the present you occupy and the future that has not arrived, are drawn in a softer material than anyone told you. Physics has been saying so about time for a century. Biology has been saying so about the body for a generation. And the traditions were saying so about the human being long before either. In language we stopped listening to because it did not come with numbers. The numbers have arrived now, small and stubborn and disputed, and they point in the same direction. You are something older and stranger and better connected than that, a living instrument, tuned by 4 billion years of practice, listening to the world at frequencies your thoughts cannot reach. The old traditions called it the inner voice, the knowing heart, the sign that comes without words. The laboratories call it presentiment, a lean of 2 seconds, an anomaly they cannot explain. Both were pointing at the same quiet thing. There is an old kind of comfort in that, and it is not the comfort of certainty, which was never on offer here. It is the comfort of company. For most of your life you have been taught, in 100 unspoken ways, that the only trustworthy part of you is the part that can give reasons, and that everything else is noise to be managed. The evidence of the last 3 hours does not overturn reason. Nothing here suggests you should stop thinking. It suggests something gentler and more human, that the part of you which has been dismissed, the part that gets uneasy without cause, that hesitates without arguments, that stands in the doorway at 11 at night for no reason at all, may not be a defect in the machinery. It may be the oldest and most experienced part of you, doing quietly what it has done since long before there was language to doubt it. You are less alone inside your own body than you were taught. So do not go looking for prophecies. You will not find any, and the people selling them are not your friends. Just do the one thing that every tradition and every instrument agrees on, and the one thing that costs nothing. When the storm comes into your chest, and the sky above you is still perfectly innocently clear, do not argue with it, and do not obey it. Be still, and notice. That is all. That is the whole instruction, and it is the same one the desert gave, and the monastery, and the meditation hall, and now, in its own cold vocabulary, the laboratory. Something in you leans toward what is coming. Be still and notice.